entitled Alternative Perspectives on American History this term, in which we are working toward reassessing the narrative of history that we have inherited. David has been encouraging us in asking the difficult questions concerning our society, our churches, and ourselves, and we are so grateful for his willingness to share his thoughts and enthusiasm with us. So, without further ado, I'd like to reintroduce Dr. David Moore.
Sure. And it's a joy to see everybody who's here tonight, to welcome those of you who were here last night, but in particular those who are here for the first time. And I will offer a few moments of review, but I felt really good about being here and using this particular theme. Couldn't use it everywhere. I was telling our class earlier that some places I would be getting death threats just because of the title. But people at SSU have always been in the mode of pursuing understanding, not hunkering down into positions. And so I like that. And so I'm not here just to provide answers, but to see if I can stimulate the kind of dialogue where we can uncover solutions together. All right? So tonight what I would like to do, last night I mentioned how the black church got its start in the United States in the 18th century. So I would like to offer a video that reenacts the scenes that led to the emergence of the black church. No audio.
Richard Allen is an American hero.
He was a pioneer, and he blazed the trail for future generations to follow.
He was the first African American leader to lead to nonviolence.
Richard Allen was born in 1760, a slave to Benjamin Chew of Philadelphia. When he was 7 years old, Chew separated Allen from his family and sold him to Stokely Sturgis in Delaware.
Your mother has already been sold. You've been separated from beloved family members. You're working long, grueling days. You look around you and all you see is slavery and bondage and hardship.
At age 17, he joined the Methodist Society, which met in the woods around the Sturgis farm.
That was really the foundational moment in his life, when he meets these Methodist ministers who are, going through Delaware and preaching the gospel, and his life is converted. He's literally changed.
The explanation of scriptures helped inform his understanding of who he was as a man. God certainly didn't make him to be bound.
When he was 26, Allen and his brother purchased their freedom, agreeing to pay $2,000 over 5 years. Allen traveled, first to Radnor, and then to Philadelphia, where he became the early morning preacher at St. George's United Methodist Church.
The Methodist Church was still very equal in the way that it treated everyone. It was not uncommon to find a black slave, for example, preaching to white slave owners.
His presence and message brought in many new members. As Allen's following grew, white church leaders began segregating African Americans in the balcony during services.
He marches to the pews that he thinks he belongs in, and one of the white leaders starts walking down the aisle to where Absalom Jones, the senior member of the black community, is praying on his knees, and he says, get up, you go to the back of the church, you don't belong here. And Allen is watching this from the side. If he tells Absalom Jones to get up, and white parishioners don't stop when we leave. If he tells Absalom Jones to get up, and white parishioners say, sit down, he's equal, we stay.
But the white parishioners were silent, and Allen and Jones led the black congregation out of St. George's.
Walking out of St. George's Church is the beginning of civil rights movement influence in American society.
That was really the moment that Allen wanted and had been waiting for.
Another critical moment occurred in the summer of 1793, when Philadelphia found itself in the grip of a devastating yellow fever epidemic. More than 10% of the city's people died, half the population left, and Allen mobilized Black Philadelphians as the foot soldiers in the war against the epidemic.
They looked at it as an opportunity to show our responsibility as citizens, our civic duty.
Allen had a relationship with Benjamin Rush, the city's leading physician, who assured him that caring for those infected with yellow fever would improve the standing of African Americans in the city.
Once the fever passed, publisher Matthew Carey printed his account of the yellow fever outbreak. He charged Black Philadelphians with theft and extortion. Allen and Absalom Jones were outraged, and they went on the offense, printing a detailed rebuttal to Carey's account.
They put together the first copy-written book by African Americans in this country.
Richard Allen understood that you got to put things down in writing. And if it's not written, then it did not happen.
A year after the fever nearly destroyed Philadelphia, Allen opened the doors of his own church at 6th and Lombard Streets, the Bethel Church.
The idea of a free, independent African church under its own control was a very powerful symbol that many blacks throughout the country latched onto, which is also what made it a threat for those who were bound to the institution of slavery. The last thing you wanted was somebody like Richard Allen out there meeting behind closed doors and nobody knew what he was saying.
Allen would use his church to further the cause of equality, operating a station on the Underground Railroad and supporting civic associations to help blacks deal with an increasingly hostile and racist America.
By the early 19th century, powerful forces were trying to undermine Richard Allen. Slavery is expanding in the South, and slaveholding interests are trying to resettle free blacks like Allen in African colonies.
White Methodists continued to claim ownership and control over Allen's congregation until 1816, when the Pennsylvania Supreme Court ruled that Allen's church would remain independent. That same year, Allen united 5 congregations to create the African Methodist Episcopal Church, the first autonomous African American religious denomination in the United States.
This is not simply a white man's republic. No one else in the white founding group of Washington, Madison, and Adams is talking in those terms. That's why Allen's so important. He comes along and pierces their thoughts and shows them, at least tries to show them, that this is a contradiction, that you can't have an empire of liberty without black freedom.
Richard Allen died in 1831, his dream for equality and freedom still burning but unrealized. A sarcophagus containing his coffin, together with his wife, Sarah Bass Allen, is on display in the museum at the Mother Bethel AME Church in Philadelphia.
Just a little bit of trivia. AME churches, African Methodist Episcopal churches are, it's over there, okay. So African Methodist Episcopal churches are all over the country and some in Canada, but no name is used more commonly than Bethel. They're called, there are a lot of AME churches, but Bethel AME is dominant, so that's how much pride they have in this particular event. Both of my parents actually, from North Carolina, in different cities, grew up in AME churches. They are not only the oldest African American denomination, but they are the oldest denomination on American soil. Also I covered last night that we want to have an alternative to status quo when we talk about dismantling white supremacy. And I use the term that I have seen come from several scholars, the term kinship of God instead of kingdom of God, since we don't resonate as easily, as readily with the term kingdom in our times. But the idea of Jesus is to bring people together in authentic relationship. And so my idea of what the replacement would be the kinship of God. I talked about white supremacy being constituted primarily of these three things. Europe, beginning in the 15th century, conquering the world, conquering the Americas, Africa, Asia, thousands of islands, Australasia, and giving these three gifts, giving the gift of language, religion, and economy. Now, they're not necessarily gifts, but in fact, in the minds of the people who were conquered, they are not gifts. But sometimes, especially religiously speaking, we kind of smooth over and say, well, at least you got Christianity out of this. And you know, it's a fragile argument, if you will, to say you at least got Christianity, because for the most part, they gained not so much Jesus, but a system of religion that oppressed them, that entitled their oppressors to take their land and to hold their bodies. So I urged us to think more pluralistically with regard to language, as in some parts of the world people do, and people speak multiple languages, not because they take courses, but because they interface with different people from different backgrounds. And to think pluralistically in terms of religion, to have respect for other people's practices, and then also to accept the fact that one way of doing economy is inadequate, that capitalism has a problem. We falsely equate free markets with free people. But you know, we have to remember that capitalism also was responsible for the enslavement of Africans on this continent and in Europe. So, you know, they don't necessarily equate. I've heard some people theorize that capitalism has gotten kinder, that it's gotten nicer, especially after, you know, slaves were emancipated, that kind of thing. But capitalism has only morphed. It hasn't, I'll give you an example that kind of helps make the case. The preeminent example to me is that, you know, the UK stopped the slave trade before the US did, under the influence of especially William Wilberforce, but many others. And it caused their economy to suffer. The fact that they couldn't trade slaves. And you know, anytime you move towards justice, you got to be prepared for the fallout. Well, what the UK did is, after they saw that this could potentially bankrupt them, they discovered poppy plants in India and what we now call Bangladesh, and they took them to China and pretty much got the whole population of China addicted to heroin, leading to the Opium Wars. But it shows that there was another kind of slavery that ensued, the slavery of Africans in Europe, in the UK. And I dare say that to this day, that capitalism is enslaving people. It is privileging a very small number of people to actually affect the health and welfare and well-being of the rest of the population, but most the underclass suffers the more. And so, you know, and I mentioned last night, I said, I know it seems permanent, but as someone wrote, so did the divine right of kings, so don't put too much stock in capitalism. Today, most young people in the United States do not support capitalism. A Harvard University survey which polled adults between the age of 18 and 29 found that 51% of respondents do not support capitalism, just as 42% said that they support it. It's not clear what they embrace as an alternative, because just 33% of them said that they support socialism. I'm not saying that socialism is a solution or the solution. What I'm saying is that we have to acknowledge the fact that capitalism is not working in terms of our humanity, and we have to think more pluralistically. Last night I talked about how the experience of being a person of color, or a subaltern, if you will, or a conquered people feels in the industrialized world, in the West. We feel like Jean Valjean, right? We feel like you've got everything you can from us. You've had our bodies, you got our land, our resources, you got everything. What more can we give? And you know the story in Les Mis is that this guy goes on for years and years, Javert, chasing Jean Valjean. And so people of color, and you know, I know that whoever it is here, you know, the indigenous people who live here in this part of the country, you know, who get blamed for the problems of society, just like in my country, the blame is going right now. African Americans are getting a slight break because we point the finger at immigrants and Muslims. But somebody has to be blamed, and so it does feel like a Jean Valjean experience. And so I've tried to break that down to understand the psychology of this. Why is it? And so I came up with the term that I mentioned last night, a disorder of territoriality. A disorder of territoriality, what I mean by that is I referenced Trayvon Martin, who was on his way home but presumed to be an interloper, a trespasser, and so he was shot and killed. People of color feel this all the time. People of color feel standing in line at the bank or sitting in a restaurant or whatever, feel like we're intruders. You know, we're sometimes looked at as intruders, and I think that feeling also has health effects in terms of stress on our lives. So I wanted to make sure that we tonight could do something, plan something, prepare something to subvert the fiction of white ownership of everything. Because in my country, it is subconscious, but it is actual. And what I mean by that is that when you hear a statement like, we've got to take our country back, you never hear people of color saying that. All right, because we don't have that inherent sense of ownership of everything. And another saying, you hear people when somebody complains about the way things are in the States, you'll hear some people say, well, you should just leave. If you think Japan has less gun violence, then just move to Japan. You know, if you think there's more justice in South Africa, then just move to South Africa. You know, and because they have this sense of entitlement and this sense of ownership that reduces people of color to a place of being interlopers. When you remember the Women's March, right? Right. So the first one took place after Inauguration Day last year. You remember that, everybody? Yes. Okay. So in my town, Santa Barbara, 7,500 people showed up. Now, you might not have anything to compare that with, but we never had anything that big. Not a concert, not an athletic event, even comes close. We're a relatively small town. In fact, some people came from other communities to participate in it. But 7,500 people marched, and I joined them, as well as other men. And I was given a chance to speak at the rally at the end, which I considered quite a privilege because I was quite visibly not a female. So I approached the crowd and I made this observation. I said, you know, after talking about how wonderful and important this is, I said, if you look around, you don't see that many people of color. And I said, I'd like to explain why that is. And it is because we've been there and done that. And you're outraged over something that we have continually been outraged over. And it's just now striking you. And so there is a lack of trust, a high degree of skepticism among people of color when we see white people protesting. It's like, well, we got to make sure this is going in the right direction before we buy our tickets. So not in my town, at least I didn't see it, but there was a sign that was very prominent around the country and in other countries that people were holding, a sign at the women's marches in other places that said these words: feminism without intersectionality is white supremacy. Anybody ever seen that sign before? Yeah, you've seen it? Feminism without intersectionality is white supremacy. The term intersectionality was coined by a legal scholar, Kimberly Crenshaw, back in 1989, and here's how it's described. Intersectionality is a theory which considers that the various aspects of humanity, such as class, race, sexual orientation, disability, and gender, do not exist separately from each other, but are complexly interwoven, and that their relationships are essential to understanding of the human condition. When systems of justice or other entities attempt to look at each aspect in isolation, then misconceptions may occur and essential understandings may be lost. Well, this is what those signs meant. They meant that if, as in Santa Barbara, if thousands of white folk get together and march for justice, but they're not aware of the conditions of the people of color in their community, then it really doesn't solve anything for those people, and ultimately doesn't solve anything for anybody, because we are one people, we meet at intersections. One of the reasons that I have been such a vocal supporter of the Me Too campaign is because of intersectionality. I think that we all benefit from the vindication and the elevation of women. So it's not just out of altruism, even though there is some degree of altruism. I just want women to get their due. You know, I want you to get your pay. I want you to get your cheddar. You know what I mean? I want you to get paid. So yeah, there is some altruism in that, but it's not only altruism. It's because I'm thinking about our entire species and our planet, because all of this is important. So in a moment, I want to talk to you about, and we're going to have a break. We didn't have a break last night, right? So I'll say this, after the break, what I want to talk about is white fragility, because that's a huge component in all of this. Why? And to ask ourselves, why are white folks so fragile when it comes to talking about race? And, you know, want to sidestep like it's a fine piece of china and we don't need to, you know, to get too close to this. We want to talk about that. But before I get there, I want to piggyback on the efforts of someone else or another organization that had as a goal dismantling white supremacy. I'm not saying that this is a comprehensive and ideal model, but I think we can learn from this model. And what it is it's the Black Panther Party. Now, when I was a college student in 1973, and I had just turned 18 years of age. Never had voted before, so I'm going to go vote. And I'm on campus. There are, you know, places to register at UC Santa Barbara. So I go up to the place to register and I look at the form, and it offers Democrat, Republican, Students for a Democratic Society. There might have been another option. And there's space for you to put your own party in. So I just pinned Black Panther Party. Now, I really, at that point, knew nothing about the Black Panther Party. I just knew that I didn't find any appeal in all the others. So I figured to have black in it, there must be something good. So you know, just started out, I started out as a Black Panther. So anyway, the Black Panther Party, under the leadership of Bobby Seale and Huey Newton, began in 1966. They started out with an armed citizens patrol to monitor the behavior, the practices of Oakland police. Now, if you don't think police are a problem, listen, police, you know, God bless the police, but we have to get beyond the idea that police are pure and perfect and do everything right. You know, you've never seen You've never heard a rap song, F the fire department, right? Everybody's okay with the fire department. So the Black Panther Party instituted a variety of community social programs, health clinics to address issues like food injustice, and they enrolled the largest number of members there in the Bay Area, Oakland, San Francisco, but they had 57 branches around the country and even some in Europe. And this is how the manual for the Black Panther Party opens. All right? I'll read this. This is how the manual opens. The unanimous declaration of the 13 United States of America. When in the course of human events it becomes necessary for one people to dissolve the political bands which have connected them with another and to assume among the powers of the earth laws of nature and of nature's God entitled them. A decent respect to the opinions of mankind requires that they should declare the causes which impel them to the separation. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. That to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed. That whenever any form of government becomes destructive of these ends, it is the right of the people to alter or abolish it, and to institute new government, laying its foundation on such principles and organizing its powers in such form as to them shall seem most likely to affect their safety and happiness. Prudence indeed will dictate that governments long established should not be changed for light and transient causes, and accordingly all experience has shown that mankind are more disposed to suffer while evils are sufferable than to right themselves by abolishing the forms to which they are accustomed. But when a long train of abuses and usurpations, pursuing invariably the same object, evinces a design to reduce them under absolute despotism, it is their right, it is their duty to throw off such government and to provide new guards for their future security. So, you know, they didn't reinvent the wheel.
No, it's there.
And so with that, I would like to just share with you the 10-point program of the Black Panthers that every member of the Black Panther Party had to memorize. We want freedom. We want power to determine the destiny of our black communities. We want full employment for our people. We want an end to the robbery by the white men of our black community. Later changed, we want an end to the robbery by the capitalists of our black and oppressed communities. We want decent housing, fit for shelter of human beings. We want education for our people that exposes the true nature of this decadent American society. We want education that teaches us our true history and our role in the present day society. We want all black men to be exempt from military service. We want an immediate end to police brutality and murder of black people. We want freedom for all black men held in federal, state, county, and city prisons and jails. We want all black people, when brought to trial, to be tried in court by a jury of their peer group or people from their black communities as defined by the Constitution of the United States. And finally, we want land, bread, housing, education, clothing, justice, and peace. Now, the difference between the Black Panther Party and the Civil Rights Movement is the Civil Rights Movement was seeking to change society in a way that accommodated people of color, whereas the Black Panther Party said they're not going to change, so we need to do our own thing. We are more familiar, the public is more familiar with the Civil Rights Movement, you know, with the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, with Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. We're more familiar with that mode of thinking. In fact, we've allowed ourselves in the United States even to have a holiday, after much travail, in honor of Dr. Martin Luther King. Whoa, would it be some kind of thing if we had a Bobby Seale holiday? that would be something. But obviously we're not quite ready for that. And so therefore it's imperative for us to be creative. We have to be creative because The civil rights movement has fallen short. The ideals were good, but it has fallen short. So we need to be creative. We need to employ as many ideas as we possibly can to come up with a solution for society. So I want to pause here and see if anybody has any feedback or any questions.
How did you feel when Fred Hampton was killed the way he was?
And you mean at the time?
Yeah.
Well, at the time I was a kid and it was, one more black person
Wow.
killed. That's the way it felt like to me, at the time.
I was in college at the time and I didn't
Okay.
have that many black friends. I was in downtown Boston at the time, but I can remember just being absolutely outraged. This was a man who was gunned down in a hail of bullets that were totally unnecessary, and it really helped galvanize a big part of the movement that was the student anti-war, anti-everything movement that was on college campuses. But remembering what you are saying about the Black Panther Party, I only have positive feelings about them, remembering what was going on in that period.
And I think it's pretty much a coup that you have positive feelings because the media would not have.
Yes, they were depicted as absolutely the enemy of the government. Well, we were all the enemy of the government then because I was about to get drafted, so I had a lot to be upset about. So I didn't have that perspective.
Yeah. It's interesting that, our country is all in favor of empowering people with guns now. And they weren't that way when the Black Panthers had guns.
I'm curious how you go about influencing those whose minds need to be broadened, shall we say, changed, if you will. You're largely preaching, if not to converted, at least those that are interested in of an open mind in settings like this.
Mm-hmm.
And I think of that in the context of Trump. How do you reach, not the 40, but at least the 25% that are too stupid to understand what he's doing to the United States, too ill-educated, too misunderstanding, whatever term you want to put on it. The question is, so I can listen to CNN, they're saying things I like, listen to Fox that I don't like. The question is, how do we go about broadening the minds of those whose narrow-minded thinking are harming themselves and everybody else?
Okay, so my point of view is that there are a number of solutions, but there's one major solution. The people who fawn the most after white supremacy are religious people. They are Christians who can't separate their faith from their racism. There's just they don't even see it that it's there. What I asserted last night is that the white church is the primary buttresser, supporter of white supremacy. And how is that? Well, I said that people complain about Oscars so white, and I said, yeah, Oscars so white is true. But so is Silicon Valley, and Wall Street is so white, and journalism is so white, and Congress is so white, and all places of power are so white. But that's not what bothers me the most. What bothers me the most is church is so white and doesn't say enough, doesn't do enough to change anything. And church is the conscience for society. And the church will not provide conscience if it finds many activities, many things to be involved in, but does not stand up to the powers that keep other people from having opportunity. I mean, what are the reasons that, in the same way that women hit a glass ceiling, what are the reasons that there are so disproportionately few African Americans in higher education? All right? I mean, there are multiple reasons. Not just economic, not just because, if we started all over right now, there are some problems right now that maybe African Americans can't afford it as readily. But also, it's that the institutions don't inspire them as much. I was interviewed by a college in my community to ask why can't we attract more African Americans? And I asked, how many African Americans do you have on faculty? At that point, they had 0. Right? Then they hired one and couldn't work with the person and fired that person. And that was 20 years ago, and they still have no African American faculty. But they say they want to be more inclusive. Well, if you want to be inclusive, you not only need faculty, you need people in administration, you need people, and the only black person I knew on that campus was a janitor. So that's not going to inspire young people to want to be a part of that economy. So this is a church thing. Oh, I should have mentioned, that was a Christian school. So this is a critical thing for the church to undertake, or else we risk running into more irrelevancy. Because we have to get out front when it comes to proclaiming hope, and you can't have hope without justice, right? Yeah, so that's the long answer. Good answer. Anybody else? Yes.
Growing up in different churches throughout my life, I always had a sense as a child that it felt like a gang.
That church felt like a gang?
Yeah. And I still get that feel from time to time. I mean, there's certain, you know, sector of culture that will veer to one church, and then another sector, generally speaking, that will veer towards another kind of church. And it kind of just, it strikes me often as like a gang mentality. And white church mostly, you know? And I think that's where the problem lies, in my own mind, is people don't want to lose their gangs.
Yeah.
They need their protection, they need their safe space, or what they think is a safe space. And it's not right, you know, but I'm not a gang person. I don't like gangs of any kind. I tended to be more of an individual and have small groups around me. And maybe that's just my reaction, my own personal reaction to gang mentality, but it does feel very much like they have their own culture, they have their own various churches, specific names to churches, and it's really hard to butt into a gang and start a conversation. And
Does anybody else feel that way?
Yeah, I can see what, yeah, each church has its own way of doing things and its own language and its own, so each church becomes its own family that understands its own family dynamics that, and I say that as a minister at 3 different churches that each have their own cultures and their own family, even within the same denomination, right? So, but I can certainly see that, I can see why you might think that. And then one of the, like, in thinking what you're saying, I'm also thinking about one of the Facebook groups for young ministers in my denomination today. There was a comment that someone was ostracized for bringing up justice issues too often from the pulpit, and that the congregation was upset that they were continuing to bring justice. And I tend to think like you, that if we're not talking about justice from behind the pulpit, then where does it get talked about? How do you, so for me, if I'm speaking to an all-white middle-class congregation and I don't mention the plight of people of the other various colors or minority problems or problems that are happening elsewhere, how will that conversation will never come up because of that gang mentality, right? Like, those conversations won't happen amongst those people unless they come from the pulpit.
unless there's a purposeful aim for that.
Yeah.
A gang with a purpose.
With a purpose.
Yeah.
Takes us back.
It's just my experience being a minister's daughter and going to the various churches and how they felt differently but the same. It's just a comment. It's not, I'm not offering any kind of solution, but I almost think there should be a vigilante kind of effort to start the conversation, to break in, or But when I was down in Southern Baptist churches too, my father used to go to Southern Baptist Convention and things, and again, I was never impressed, even as a young child. So what I'm just saying is, even, I'm not saying the vineyard's like that necessarily, but it does have a certain culture that's different than the United Church, that's different than the Baptist Church. And I don't know how you break up gangs and pull them all together, but by some kind of very strong force.
I can speak to the States. I'm cautious about Canada, not having really experienced it, but because we are so hyper-capitalized, it's one of the reasons we have so many churches, so many different kinds of churches. because it's basically like starting your own mom and pop, your own business in many cases. In some parts of the world, you would have had been appointed by the government or by the king or whoever to have a clerical position, but in the States, you can have a high school education and just, you know, if you can get enough people together to buy some property or rent some property, you can do your own thing and you can make money doing that, because that's what it is. It's capitalism, and part of the capitalism makes it really competitive. So I was talking with Peter and Mary Ellen last night that, you know, sometimes we're so competitive that when we're going for our own gang, if you will, our own organization, we build it on the backs of other organizations. We recruit people who go to other churches and say, come to this church. And, you know, I see it in my community. I see, you know, I was telling them that we have a church in our town that has the coolest band, the coolest clothes. They even have CO2 smoke going across the stage while the band is playing. Because everybody has to have something. You know, they have to do something to attract people. And, you know, and it comes down to capitalism. Even though we do use spiritual language and we become, you know, we have a Bible and we're really biblical about what we're saying, we're really trying to sell a product. And one, you know, church sociologists are saying this, that I've read about, is that younger people are not as attracted to institutions. And so this is not going to work much longer. That my generation, baby boomers, we like institutions. You know, yeah, I know we grew up in the 60s, but we do like institutions. We like big buildings. You know, we like mega churches. That's just what we're drawn to. But a younger generation is looking for a more authentic relationship, and they're really, oddly enough, they're actually into Jesus. And that might surprise you that you know, these wild, immoral teenagers are interested in Jesus, but they just don't want the way things have been packaged. So, you know, we can call it a gang, I suppose, but really what it comes down to is we have the freedom to operate legally and do almost anything short of David Koresh. You know, we can get away with, you know, teaching whatever we want to teach and you know, our own approach, and do it to compete with others. The problem here is you know, we have to ask ourselves, are we expanding the kinship of God? You know, are we entering into dialogue? You know, the people who are closest to you, I mean, your friends. Think about that for a moment. Who are my friends? Who do you know that you would feel comfortable asking for a loan, borrowing money? All right? Those are the people who enrich you. Those are the people who give foundation to your life. And really, that's what church community should be. It should not be a performance. But I mentioned last night how David from Nicaragua in Halifax talked about how he grew up as a Baptist and had to leave the Baptist church to join the resistance to do God's work. Because the Baptist church wasn't about God's work, it was about praying. And I think that's pretty much representative of the way that we do church. We're about, you know, we should pray about that, but, you know, get out there and march, that's a little bit extreme. But, you know, so we relinquish our moral authority and our opportunity to be the conscience for society all too often by getting hijacked into prayer. I mean, that sounds strange. A pastor's up there saying, you're getting hijacked into prayer? But that's really what happens when you dismiss the opportunities to actually get involved in people's lives and changing things. You know, I mean, it could mean writing to people who are legislators. It could be showing up. You know, to me, it was the work of God. When some of you might have seen this on television, but disabled people went to Capitol Hill. I don't know, anybody see that?
Yes.
Disabled. They showed up in their wheelchairs and with their crutches and with their oxygen machines, and they went to the Congress people and said, you can't take away our health care. Now, it's tragic that disabled people have to do that, but this is where the church should be acting. The church who believes in healing and believes and taking care of people. The pastor should have been there, but American pastors, I don't know about that. But that's, all of the pastors in the greater Washington area, as soon as they found out about it, should have been right there in the faces of those legislators, instead of leaving it to disabled people to have to fight for themselves. That's just my point of view, anyway.
Good point.
All right, so, I talked to you about how, let's see, how are we doing for time? What time is it?
7:20.
Okay, so this will take us to right around 7:30. I talked to you about how capitalistic we are, and so I'd just like to submit this to you for your consideration.
If you want to understand the celebrity culture in the church today, you need to listen to President Eisenhower. The question for this video comes from Sean Quillen on my Facebook page. He asked, why do we make idols out of Christian ministers and Christian artists? That's a great question, and it's one that a lot of people have been asking in recent years as we see one celebrity pastor after another embroiled in scandals and controversies. Rachel Held Evans wrote an article about this for Relevant Magazine not that long ago, and a panel discussed the same question at a recent T4G conference. Most explanations focus on our corrupt hearts and our desire for a visible human leader to follow. But those explanations, while very legitimate, overlook something really important. First of all, celebrity pastors are nothing new. People have always exalted human leaders, going all the way back to the book of Judges. And every generation has had its handful of well-known preachers. What's different today, however, is the number of celebrity pastors. We've created an entire celebrity class within American evangelicalism, and the reason goes way beyond our corruptible hearts. And that brings me to President Eisenhower. In his farewell address to the nation in 1961, Eisenhower warned about the rise of what he called the military-industrial complex. After World War II, for the first time, America had a permanent arms industry that employed millions of people. Eisenhower realized that the arms industry needed wars to keep selling their products. Being a former general, Eisenhower saw the danger. He predicted that the military-industrial complex would push the U.S. to massively grow its military and get into unnecessary wars for economic reasons. And he was right. So what does this have to do with the rise of celebrity pastors? Well, like the military-industrial complex, there is also an evangelical-industrial complex that has created a celebrity culture within the church for economic gain. Have you ever wondered why you don't see pastors from small churches on the stages of conferences? Or why most of the best-selling Christian authors tend to be megachurch leaders? The story we want to believe is that the most godly, intelligent, and gifted leaders naturally attract large followings, and that their ideas are so great, their books are naturally the ones that get published and become bestsellers. And so, of course, they would be the ones to speak at the big national conferences. Is that story possible? Yeah. Does it happen? Occasionally. But is it the norm? Sadly, no. Here's the other story, the one that we don't like to tell. Publishers need to sell books, and a lot of them. So they look for authors that already have large audiences. Megachurch pastors are the obvious choice. Sometimes the pastor will write the book, but it's not uncommon for a ghostwriter to be hired by the publisher to turn the pastor's sermon notes into a book that he then just puts his name on. The publisher will then promote the pastor and his book at sponsored ministry conferences. The hope is that between the pastor's own megachurch audience and the publisher's conferences, the book will become a bestseller and make a lot of money for the publisher. If that doesn't work, sometimes elaborate schemes are used to manipulate the sales of the book and literally buy it onto the bestsellers list. Yeah, it's unethical, and some pastors have been caught and shamed for doing it, but it's sadly common among church leaders today. In order to keep this $7 billion business model going, the evangelical industrial complex has had to create more and more celebrity pastors. So why are there now so many celebrity pastors? Because they generate a lot of revenue for the evangelical industrial complex. And why do these pastors fall with such regularity? Because the EIC uses a business standard rather than a biblical standard when deciding which leaders to promote. American evangelicalism is no longer a meritocracy where a leader's gifts, character, or wisdom result in greater influence. Instead, it's an aristocracy where simply having a large platform now entitles you to even more influence, even if you completely lack the character or wisdom to handle it. So what are we supposed to do about the EIC? Well, here's 3 suggestions. First, rethink the voices that you listen to. Just because a book or a leader is popular, you should never assume that he or she is mature, godly, or even orthodox. Secondly, reward those publishers, radio programs, conferences, or podcasts that clearly care more about sanctity than celebrity. Use your money to support voices that may not be popular, but which need to be heard by the church and by the culture. Finally, return some of the authority that you've granted to the evangelical industrial complex to your local church. Real ministry happens in the context of relationships. Books and conferences and podcasts are great, but we still need incarnate men and women to function in our communities as our spiritual mothers and fathers. So Sean, thanks for the great question. You're going to get a free 1-year subscription to my email devotional, With God Daily. If you've got a question you'd like me to address in a future video.
Okay, so I know that that probably wasted your time because nobody in St. Stephen actually thinks that way, but just indulge me. Someone wrote a book, we're going to take our break, but someone wrote a book, I can't remember the exact title now, but it talks about church as a cruise ship, right? Because, originally ships were to bring people from one place to another, right? They were called ocean liners, so they brought people from Europe to the States and to Canada and things, South America, but developed. And people didn't want to go on ocean liners. So the people who made and operated ships had to develop a purpose for them. And they came up with the idea of cruises, where instead of you going from one place to another, you just go in circles, and it works. Well, this illustration was used to show how megachurches are so central in the United States, because they are one stop for everything. And they've had to add this and the other thing, add programs, because if you go to a cruise ship, you've got a gym, you've got multiple restaurants and a bar and another bar, and everything you need is right there. You can live on that thing for a week. Well, you can live in some churches for a week because they are meeting every possible need that you can think of. And that's why it's equating it with cruise ships. But what it's saying, the idea behind it is that the idea behind the case being made is to warn us that this is not where millennials are. They're not in the cruise ship church mentality. They're looking for something small. In fact, the first thing millennials think when they see something big is there's some corruption in there somewhere. And they don't trust it, all right? They don't even have to decide that. That's just the way it is. That's a mega church. They're doing something underhanded. And so, we want to make sure that we're prepared for our tomorrows and prepare our hearts for tomorrow. So let's take a break. How long, Rebecca?
How much? 15?
15, good. What do you all say?
15.
All right, so we're going to take a break and then come back and talk about white fragility.